From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And today, an extended visit with K-State's Jaymelynn Farney as she discusses several considerations when grazing the cow herd on winter annual cover crops. She talks about her research on cattle preference for the different cover crop forages and the nutritional value of each, recommended stocking rates, avoiding acidosis and grass tetany issues when grazing the herd on these rich forages, and balancing the nutrient intake by grazing these cover crop stands in tandem with nearby field crop residue. Jaymelynn will cover all of that next. Also, K-State's Mike Brouk awaits with another Milk Lines as he advises you dairy producers to size up the current market for their raw milk, and he'll explain why. All that here on Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues now. And we have the opportunity to speak with a beef systems specialist for K-State Research and Extension. She's based in southeast Kansas and has logged a lot of research work into the area of cover crop utilization for grazing. Wanted to bring her in and talk a few principles of turning the cow herd out on those various forages now. Jaymelynn Farney. Jaymelynn, you have been looking at this diligently for so long now. There are several things that producers may want to think about. We'll get into those, but what's your sense of it? Is there still very much high interest in cover crop grazing?
Oh, yes, Eric. There is lots of interest. And if our weather participates, which, that's the big if, this is a wonderful forage to be able to allow cattle producers to put some gain on thin cows. I made sure I wanted to bring that up because everybody's like, oh, yeah, we just turn out because it's there, etc. There's some actual direct benefits to grazing some of these annual forages, aka the cover crops, from the cattle side. And one that often gets forgot about is it is a very high protein, high energy feed that for your cow-calf production system, if your cows are coming into gestation, that dry pregnant cow, you just weaned your calves, put them out on there and a body condition score 4. Putting them on cover crops is a great way to increase that body condition score without any supplemental feed. So there's several examples like that you can use. They are, like I said, if the weather is very good, we can put a pretty high stocking rate on there. So you can be able to put a high concentration of animals on a small area for a short period of time and be able to allow rest on your other perennial pastures, which there's been a lot of research that shows that rest on your perennials is a great way to keep it rejuvenated, change in some of your compositions, a bunch of really good benefits.
There are various types of cover crops, as we know here, and we could talk about the grasses, the brassicas. What are you sensing would be the most favorable in that respect, or is there an advantage one over the other?
There's been a lot of work that's been really kind of looking into plant species for the livestock side. And as you'd mentioned, you can go and look on like the NRCS website, and there's 50 different options that they recommend have some soil, organic matter, plant diversity / insects, or, beneficial pollinator benefits, etc. So as a producer looking to pick what you want to plant, it can be daunting. I've done some work looking at cattle preference. And this shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody who ever watches how cattle eat. They like grass species the best. That's what they choose. That's what they're used to. I've seen that in both cool season and your warm season annuals, even when they had legumes. Because everybody's like, oh, if there's alfalfa out there, they go after alfalfa first. Well, not necessarily. We're seeing that it's kind of like candy. You don't want to eat candy at every meal. And cattle are kind of the same way. They really do prefer those grasses first. Then they like the legumes. And from the brassica perspective, I have a love-hate relationship with them. They are a very high-producing, high biomass plant if you get the rain. If you don't get any rain, they just don't grow very well. Nothing grows very well if you don't get any rain, but the brassicas in particular. So they're very beneficial from that perspective. And some of the Nebraska data has found that about a pound of the brassica seed can replace 20 pounds of our cereal grains, one of our winter cereal grains, when you're planting it. And you get the same amount of biomass. So that can be used as kind of an economic tool to help you decide whether to include it or not in your winter annuals or your fall winter annual grazing. But where I have some concerns with the brassicas is when they do get to growing and you have a really good amount of population out there, they can overshadow your grasses. And for the younger calves, anything that weighs under 600 pounds, if you have more than about a pound of brassicas planted out there with your cereal grass, I've seen reductions in cattle gain, primarily because those 600-pound calves just don't know how to eat it, don't like it. There's some negatives to those brassicas. For cows, 2 pounds of brassicas out there in the mix, I like that. And the cows really do very well on it. The other part of the, like I said, that love-hate relationship, they're really high moisture, so you like that, because those cows in the winter, you don't have to haul as much water if you're hauling water, because they're meeting their water requirements by consuming those brassicas. But at the same time, there are so much water to them that they have to graze longer to meet their dry matter daily requirements. So it's kind of a balancing act. So that's several different things you have to think about as you are choosing what to plant in your fields.
And we share all that under the presumption that there may well be yet a window of opportunity for producers to seed these crops, although we're getting toward the latter end of that window, Jaymelynn?
We really are. Typically in Kansas, we're most successful getting these fall-winter annuals established prior to about September 20th. Yeah. There has been some folks that, you could put out the small grains later in October and be fine. But typically when we're wanting to plant dual purpose wheat, that's when we're also wanting to try and get our other cool season annuals established.
Let's go under the presumption then that we've producers out there who have already selected a cover crop, have planted it, it's fairly well established, the recent rains have helped push it along. Some things to think about in as far as turnout, the timing of putting the herd out there, stocking rates and so forth. What can you share along those lines, Jaymelynn?
That's a great question, Eric, and every producer is going to be a little different depending on class, goals, objectives, etc. But what we typically say or recommend is for these cool season annual grasses species, which is still going to be your predominant forage out there, or hopefully that's your predominant forage out there. You want it to be at least 6 inches tall before you begin grazing. That allows the plant to be established enough, have a good enough root system that it can continue to grow through the winter, as well as be able to have enough root mass to possibly get some of your other soil benefits. That's why you kind of planted the cover crops. But about 6 inches high is the start grazing height. And some other researchers have said, don't graze it below 2 inches. Well, I've seen some folks graze it much shorter than that, and it still seems to be okay. And on the brassicas, if you have cows out there, you can turn them out anytime, and they seem to graze those brassicas well. Now, if you have your weaned calves turned out, and there's a pretty significant amount of brassicas in your field, I would wait until after a good killing freeze before you start grazing on those brassicas. At that point, those calves do like them. They will consume them and get some pretty good gains. So that's where we've seen some discrepancies in some of the research where folks say, I find that my calves under 6 weight don't gain very well grazing those brassicas. Well, we've started grazing them before the freeze, whereas other folks in Nebraska see similar gains as just wheat or rye, but they wait to graze that in January after you've had a good kill and freeze. And, it's a palatability deal. If they don't eat it, they don't get the good benefit of the brassicas, which I didn't mention this earlier. Nutritionally, brassicas come up with about the same amount of energy as corn. So if they eat it, you get good gains. If they're not going to eat it, does you no good.
And when you think about how thickly to stock these cover crops, it would differ some from our normal rates that we'd see for native grasses, say, would it not?
It does. We can stock this much heavier than you do on your native grasses. Part of that is because, in general, while we're wanting to graze these cool season annuals, they have a much denser energy and protein than our natives do. And so we don't need as much forage to meet our energy and protein, but they also are growing so rapidly that you have a pretty significant amount.
Well, hold that thought for a moment, if you would, Jaymelynn. We'd like to get a ballpark idea on generally how heavily to stock that cover crop stand for cow herd grazing. Managing that resource is our topic right here with K-State Beef Systems Specialist Jaymelynn Farney, who once more has been researching extensively cover crop utilization as a cow herd grazing forage during the fall and winter. We'll be back with more from Jaymelynn after this break. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues now, and once again we're in touch with K-State Research and Extension Beef Systems Specialist Jaymelynn Farney. She's based in southeast Kansas, and over the years she has generated quite a wealth of information on making the best use of cover crops as a beef cattle grazing forage. And what we're looking at here today is maximizing that grazing resource for the cow herd. As we're deep into fall now, obviously, and soon, one might say even too soon, into winter, and Jaymelynn producers may have stands of planted cool season grasses, legumes, possibly brassicas out there, and they're thinking about how they can optimize those as forages for their cow herds. Just before the break, you were getting into the stocking rate question, and you say there is a fairly universal rule of thumb that producers can at first consider anyway. What is that?
Typically, Eric, you can run about one 600-pound animal on 1 acre for about 1 month. And so that's kind of a number you can use for, just ballparking. Right. Of course, that will change based on weather and how much is growing out there. And, so you can also use that same number to help scale it up to your cows. If you have a 1,200-pound cow, you got to double that amount. That kind of gives you somewhere to start.
Right. One thing I want to bring up here, and there's so many angles on this we could take up, but when we think about producers who have grazed, say, alfalfa, a legume in the past, and there is the perpetual concern about gastronomic issues such as acidosis, would one need to watch that with some of these other kinds of cover crops, the grasses, the brassicas, or other legumes as they're grazing now?
Yes, you do have to worry about some digestive issues or some other metabolic potentials. Yeah. Acidosis, it's not the typical acidosis we think with the high corn feeding. We're talking more about a frothy bloat or a foamy bloat. That's something that anybody who's grazed wheat knows. And most of these other winter annuals are pretty much just like grazing wheat. So you do need to be worried about the foamy bloat. And that just happens because the really rapidly growing, very highly digestible, high protein, high energy feed is the perfect storm to kind of put this foam on the top of the rumen environment, where all the digest is at. And so the calves just can't eructate. And that just makes it where it's very tough on them digestively. Luckily, we have some management practices that you can implement to help manage for that. If you can wait to turn out the cattle until about midday, let them get full on dry roughage before you kick them out. That is one way to kind of help reduce, that initial shock to their rumen environment. There is use of things like poloxamine. One of the brand names is Bloat Guard, but if you just look for poloxamine, anywhere fed at 1 to 2 grams per 100 pounds of body weight has been shown to reduce issues of foamy bloat. And your ionophores, they also have been found to help with that. Not as good as the poloxamine, but the ionophores are much more readily available often than the poloxamine. So that can that's one thing to worry about. Another one is grass tetany. For those of you who are fall calving producers, this is a really big concern for you. And, yes, I am talking about grass tetany in the winter. Usually we talk about it in the spring, but it's the exact same concept as during the spring. When you have a lush, rapidly growing forage, which that's what we have at this time, they're typically very low in magnesium, and that's one of the deals that leads to cows going down, especially when they're at peak lactation. So we want to make sure that you have a high magnesium mineral out there, but also that they are consuming it. So don't just dump it out and assume that it's going to fix it. Keep records of how quickly they go through a bag of mineral and the number of head and what is the intake supposed to be. And if it's not near what it's supposed to be, entice them to come and eat more of it. Put some salt in, put some dry distillers, pour in some molasses, something to make them eat it. So that's one thing that we often forget about that. Now, grass tetany is not near the issue in that dry pregnant cow, or if you have those weaned calves out there. And actually the weaned calves rarely ever show grass tetany. So that's something, if depending on how risk adverse you are, which class of animals to put on this forage. And if you want more information just on the grass tetany, it would have been, I believe it was last week on my podcast, Dr. Jay's Beef. I had a professor from North Dakota State specifically talk just on grass tetany.
That's a great resource, by the way, which we didn't mention. Dr. Jay's Beef, Jaymelyn's podcast, covers many, many topics, including, in that case, grass tetany when grazing these rich forages. So, Jaymelynn, we've tons of other things we could get into, but time won't permit. What among the things we haven't brought up today do you think need to be highlighted right here for producers as they're thinking about managing those cover crops for grazing?
We always want to be able to maximize our land usage to the greatest degree. And, I'd mentioned this a few times, and until you actually sit there and pencil it out, it's sometimes hard to do audibly. But because they are so high in energy and protein, if you already have cows in good flesh, good condition, that are already body condition score 6, they're just going to keep getting fatter on these annual forages unless you implement almost a restricted grazing for them. One of the things that I really think is a wonderful diet for a dry pregnant cow is if you have access to corn milo residue right next to these annual forages. That provides a wonderful diet. It takes about 2 acres of the corn or milo residue in average years, about 120 bushel corn yield, and about 1.25 acres to 1.5 acres of the annual forages. And you can run a 1,300 pound dry pregnant cow for 90 days on that. And that gives them the ideal dietary balance to be able to maintain them. And that allows you to get a lot of great usage out of your land. And you don't have to, if you're just looking at grazing residue, you're not having to go out and supplement them. Yep. So, economic benefit as well. We've also seen that limit grazing them, actually only allowing the cattle to have enough acres to graze on for 4 days or 3 days or a week or whatever you determine is how often you want to move them in a rotational or a strip grazing. You can choose whichever method works better for you. But that can allow you to increase your stocking rates and increase your utilization to a higher degree. And in some smaller research projects, and when I say smaller, they're in 4-acre plots, it allows a more even manure distribution, which, that's a good benefit to our crop ground, but, also a detriment because if we haven't been able to teach our cattle to urinate and defecate in every square inch of a field. But if you can implement some of those management practices, you can maybe be able to help with your organic matter component to a higher degree. So you can increase stocking rate, get a more even manure distribution. But on the other side, you have to have more labor and more fencing equipment as well.
There's almost an art to cover crop grazing that goes along with the science, Jaymelynn. There's something to that.
There really is. And the more you play and try working with it, the better you will get. And that's what the guys who've jumped on grazing this early, you can spend all day visiting with them and they'll say, well, yeah, that worked, that didn't work, and we figured out this was worth our extra time or that wasn't worth our extra time or money.
Those conversations are worthwhile, and we've been tapping into the wealth of information that you and colleagues at K-State have been accumulating over recent years on cover crop utilization. You can go to the K-State Research and Extension site and find much of that, and that'll eventually take you to work that Jaymelynn's been involved with as well. So we appreciate you taking this time aside, Jaymelynn, to go over some of the principles here based on good research. Thanks, and we will talk again very soon.
Thank you, Eric.
Jaymelynn Farney is a beef systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension, going over some things to contemplate when turning the cow herd out on winter annual forages as cover crops. You are tuned to Agriculture Today. In a moment, we'll hear from K-State's Mike Brouk. He stands by with another milk lines and more still ahead here on the K-State Radio Network. For you next, this week's edition of Milk Lines, featuring K-State Research and Extension dairy specialist Mike Brouk. And by necessity, you dairy producers are preoccupied with the production side of the operation. That is a constant calling, of course, but this week Mike's asking you to give due attention to the marketing side of the equation. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the trends that we're seeing in fluid milk sales across the United States. As we look over the past year, there's been a steady decline again in the sales of fluid milk. And it's really kind of concerning as we look at the decrease that has occurred since 2009. Since 2009, the total amount of milk sold through fluid sales has declined by about 16.4%. And over the last several years, we continue to see steady declines each year. While as a dairy producer, we may not be able to directly impact this, we need to be aware of it because it does impact what type of market we will be selling our raw milk into as we look to the future. For many years, if you look back to about 1975, the sale or actual volume of fluid milk that was sold in the United States was actually fairly level year to year. Since 2009, that has not been the case. Are there some bright spots in fluid milk sales? Well, there are, and some of the things that we are seeing are increases in the fact that we sell a little more milk as flavored milk than we did in the past. And we also are seeing a slight increase in whole milk sales across the United States. while these are bright spots, they still do not make up for the losses that we're seeing in other types of fluid milk. So, as you think about what you might be doing with your raw milk, you need to look at how it's turned into different products and how that might affect your future ability to sell milk, raw milk, into the marketplace. The co-op or other entity that you sell your raw milk to, are they heavily invested in fluid milk sales, or do they have other ways that they can utilize that milk, such as cheese or soft products? Maybe something like ice cream could be a possibility as well. Or maybe it's milk powder, and in the case of export markets, maybe we need to look at whole milk powder. So as a dairy producer, I want to encourage our dairymen to take a look at how their raw milk is actually utilized in the marketplace and what outlets that they might have to ensure that they have a ready market for additional raw milk in the future. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike, as always. And we'll close out today's edition with word for you cattle producers on a series of meetings that you may well be interested in anticipation of this next calving season. K-State's Animal Sciences and Industry Department and Research and Extension are planning a series of calving schools beginning in December, continuing through January, and it's not too early to get these on your calendar. These programs will outline the overall calving management, including the stages of the normal calving process, and advice on handling difficult calving situations. Once more, headlining this series, K-State Research and Extension beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff. There'll also be the demonstration of the proper use of calving equipment, this on that life-size cow and calf model. And there will be other timely educational topics, depending on the location, such as forage sampling and analysis, and vaccine care and handling. Here is the lineup for K-State's series of calving schools this winter: Wednesday, December the 15th in Tonganoxie, northeast Kansas; Thursday, December 16th in Burlington, southeast Kansas. Then in January the 5th, on a Wednesday, in Colby in the northwest; Thursday, January the 6th, Lakin in southwest Kansas; Tuesday, January the 11th, back in northeast Kansas at Fairview; and lastly, Thursday, January the 13th in McPherson, central Kansas. You can contact the respective extension offices in those locations for more information and to pre-register. And with that, our time today comes to a close. Thanks for being along with us. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.